Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage.
Oh man, it's cold out here. Okay, I'm back. Man, am I determined. You know, it's now getting to be mid-December and it's freezing out here, but I still want to come out here to the garage and do my videos. And of course I have shorts on. Doesn't help. And they're predicting for Friday and Saturday this week that the temperatures are going to hit around 50 degrees. My plan was to wait until then, and if it did come around to be anywhere near that temperature, I would do video then. But you know what? I've been feeling kind of down for a few days, and you know, it always helps to do one of these videos, post it up there, connect with my friends. And so I decided, you know what? Why wait another 3-4 days for temperatures that may not come anyway? So I'm out here. Man, am I cold. You know, I had a hot cup of coffee in the other room in the main part of my condo, and I should have really brought it here. And the little tiny candle I have lit behind me doesn't really add much heat. Okay, so, you know, doing these videos out here, I may get another one in, you know, this weekend if when Friday and Saturday comes around. If the weather is as they're predicting, I may get another one done, but that probably will be it for the year. Now, of course, the last 12 videos I've been saying that will probably be it for the year, for every single one of them. I'm not going to say it with this one. And when I don't say it, it probably will be the last one. So I'm just going to randomly select a few things, try to not think about how my teeth are chattering, and see what I come up with. Somebody that I spoke. Did I pull something? Oh no, I was speaking to somebody, one of my buddies, about Anthony Phillips' 1984. I did pull out his 1984 album, didn't I, in the last video? I have another one. I think I have a whole Anthony Phillips section there. One of my earliest acquisitions. This may in fact have been my first Anthony Phillips album. I'm not sure. Private Parts and Pieces #2. That I don't think I have this on CD now that I think about it. It was a Gem Records import. Gem Records was a really big, well, it was based here in New Jersey and California, I see on the sticker here. And this sticker was very familiar. You see the Gem Records sticker there. Right there, right there. I can't get the camera thing down. That Gem Records sticker at one point in the late 70s was probably on about 70% of the albums that I bought, because I would pretty much go straight to the import section. And they were big on importing artists who didn't get their music released in the country here in the U.S., but that had cult followings, which always pretty much, I guess, applied to Anthony Phillips. Maybe through his Genesis connection, to being an early member. And at that time, Genesis wasn't a huge pop band, but they were a very big cult band. And I think most of the people at this time, in the later half of the 70s, that were Genesis fans, excuse me, probably knew who had been in the band, probably had the Trespass album at very least. So this one actually came out in 1980. I'm guessing, I think this was his third album. He did The Geese and the Ghost, which was his first album, had some vocal tunes on there. But it introduced most folks to his primarily, not entirely acoustic, but primarily acoustic music. And also pretty much at the same time came out with Private Parts and Pieces #1. And this was #2. And I want to say, I think this is the, I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I think this came out, I think this was his third album. It's got wonderful cover art, and at this time he had the same cover artist all the time. And I want to say it's Peter Cross is his name, but I can't find the credit on here. Yes, cover design, Peter Cross. This is a very good album. A whole bunch of, I'm not sure. There's generally one, on most of the albums at this time, they're instrumental albums, primarily acoustic, but there's quite often and usually one vocal track sung by Anthony Phillips on here. He's got Andy McCulloch on drums and percussion. Mike Rutherford from Genesis plays bass on one track, and there's an oboe player. And Mel Collins plays flute. Mel Collins from King Crimson. And it tells you most of the material was recorded either June 76 or November and December 77. So it took a few years for it to come out. But this, I got a lot of Anthony Phillips CDs. I'm not sure that I have this one on CD. It's certainly come out. The record company was Passport Records. Actually, it's funny. Now look at it. This is got the sticker for Gem Records Import, but for a few years, Passport Records, which was, again, a very small record label, but based here in New Jersey, did have a contract and did release a lot of albums by these kind of cult artists that otherwise would have been imports. So I don't know why the Gem Records Import sticker on here, when in fact it's Passport Records, right from the very state that I live in, that released this here in America. What can I say? This is maybe the third solo album I had by Anthony, and he's just such a fantastic musician. Maybe known primarily as a guitarist, but could have easily made a living as a keyboard player. Though most of the time he sticks to piano. I know it was later in the 90s he did have a bit more synthesizer on his albums, but I think that was primarily because a lot of the music he was composing was not necessarily for solo albums per se, but were for movie soundtracks and mostly British television, and so he would use synthesizers kind of in an orchestral way. Some of my favorite Anthony Phillips albums I will never pull out on a vinyl pull because I don't have them and they didn't come out on vinyl. So I'm pretty limited. I think I may only have maybe another two or three Anthony Phillips vinyl before the kind of CD era came around, and I started picking them up on CD. This is highly recommended from what I remember, but I don't have a lot of remembrance of it. And there's just various pictures of like some of the British countryside and things like that. And boy, if you don't hear the British countryside in Anthony Phillips music, you don't hear it anywhere. I can't think of another composer, musician whose music to me calls up that imagery. And I guess, it helps the fact that I knew that he was British. I think I would hear that even if it weren't there. The only other people that I can think of that draw up the kind of landscape imagery that much of Anthony Phillips's music does is actually like classical orchestral music from various composers. And a lot of that music, for me, has a lot of visual images associated with it. But Private Parts and Pieces 2, subtitled Back to the Pavilion. That was an early one. I would have bought that in 1980. Well, here's one. What can you say about this? Probably anybody that watches my videos is going to know this. Still makes me sad. But John Abercrombie, his first great quartet. This was his first actual working band that he had. All of his groups prior to this and his albums were basically musicians playing on his studio album sessions, but not a group. Is this their last album? or is M their last album? I think this is their second album, with no title, just Abercrombie Quartet. A great band, and actually, the bass player George Mraz, I'm not sure if I had heard him before. Probably not. Though George Mraz has played everywhere with everybody in the jazz world. Peter Donald, the drummer, I definitely had not heard before this. And Richie Byrock, the incredible jazz pianist, I had not heard before this either. And what a great band, because this music is, for a quartet of basically drums, upright bass, piano, and electric guitars, sometimes acoustic guitars, and of course John's mandolin. You think of, well, there's a rhythm section there and piano and it's driving, but this is such a delicate band. I mean, they definitely could wail. There's definitely YouTube videos of them in live performance, and of course in live performance they got into it a bit more intense. But man, their studio albums can't be beat, and they're pretty low key. And this may be slightly more up tempo than their other two albums. It's hard to say. They always had quiet, ballady pieces and kind of expansive pieces. I know Dear Rain is on here, which is certainly a ballad. Madagascar by Richie Byrock, which is... It seems like there's at least one kind of epic piece on each one of their albums, if not more. That's kind of a farther looking piece. You can't say it's mainstream jazz. It's not really a ballad. And on this track, on this album, Madagascar, which runs for 9 minutes, is that track by Richie Byrock. All three of their albums were entirely composed by either John Abercrombie or pianist Richie Byrock. Now, the last album, M, did have one track written by bassist George Mraz, and it was a shame he didn't write more, because I really dug that track on the M album. And what can I say? This was recorded in November 1979. It took ages and ages for this to become available on CD, but the group only recorded 3 studio albums, and ECM finally, a couple years ago, repackaged in a little box set all 3 of the studio albums, which is good because there's a lot of very quiet music on their 3 albums. And at various times, and I've said this before, I think I did, I think on a vinyl pull, I think I've already pulled out the Arcade album, which is the first album the group did together, and the M album. I think I pulled out the other 2, but I could be wrong. Because I remember saying that at various times, all 3 albums are so good that they've all rotated being my favorite in the group depending on what kind of mood I was in at the time. And of course, now I pull this out and I want to hear it again. It's sad now, now that John's gone. John passed away, I'm sure it was August, so it would have been August 2017, and it was a little bit over a year ago. And man, I still feel that, but it's strange. Sometimes when artists that I love pass away, and I've been into them for a lot of years, it's really hard for me to listen to their music for a long period of time. Sometimes it's just better that I get into them after they're gone, like I did with Wes Montgomery. But with John, his music is just so good that I would find myself desiring to hear it again, even shortly after his passing. And I've been pretty much playing it to the same extent that I did when he was still around. But what can I say? It was definitely he wasn't particularly a young man, but he had a ways he could have kept going, and he was still doing gigs and recordings and stuff like that. So once again, hearing of his passing was a bit of a shock. My oh my, another ECM. Well, you're getting your ECM dollars worth here. Here's the only Ralph Towner solo album that I have on vinyl from ECM that I still haven't picked up the compact disc for. And that's Solo Concert, a live album. Just Ralph on his own. Only playing 12-string and classical guitars. He doesn't play any piano here. which may be the lack of variety of pieces, and because it's live and not overdubbed in the studio and there's no additional musicians, I don't mind that aspect so much. But it's an all-guitar album. It's brilliant, though. Maybe the reason why I didn't necessarily run to pick it up yet on CD, recorded October 1979. So this would have come out in 80, and I probably bought it at that time. But Ralph's done a lot of solo guitar albums, not necessarily live, but live in the studio. I think this might be the only actual live in front of an audience one. But probably for the last 15 or more years now, maybe even 20, all of the albums that he's done in the studio under his own name that are him solo have been just solo guitar albums. He doesn't play keyboards on them, and they're live in the studio. He hasn't gotten into the overdubbing thing like he did back in the Blue Sundays or with Diary, and I think Diary was 1973. And of course, people like Carm and myself, we're dying to hear another Ralph Towner solo album done in the studio with overdubbing and bringing the synthesizers and the keyboards and the little hand percussion and even the French horn that Ralph plays sometimes. Though of all of his solo, and I have a bunch, not all actually, of his recent solo albums, which are live in the studio, probably if I had this on CD, this might be the one that I would pull out probably first. I think the pieces are a little more expansive. His pieces now tend to be fairly short, and these are slightly a bit longer. There's 7-minute and 8-minute pieces on here. And he does Nardist by Miles Davis, a version of that for guitar, and he does, speaking of John Abercrombie connection, he plays a version of Timeless by John Abercrombie, just on acoustic guitar, live solo. It's kind of a weird setting for that track, which was very heavy electric organ and electric guitar and kind of electronic atmosphere to it. And to hear it played on a single acoustic guitar is a little bit strange, but very nice. I'm not really, maybe I'm talking faster, or I don't have as much to say about these individual albums, or it's just me freezing my butt off that I'm only 17 minutes into it and I've done 3 albums already. Now definitely left field. Klaus Schulze Transfer album. I remember buying this. in the record store. This was an import record store that I used to travel to about twice a year. I would generally do probably a winter run and a summer run. And then sometimes, this is long before the internet, sometimes also, if I couldn't take it anymore, and I might go 3 or 4 times a year. This started the period where I wasn't as in love with, I guess, the second phase of Klaus Schulze's career, when he either started using, depending on which recording you get, a lot of very heavy drum machine beats, or an actual percussionist playing drums, which he had used previously. But in this case, at around this time, he really kind of amped up the percussion, and it was very aggressive, very high in the mix, pretty much up-tempo, instead of it just being like kind of a rhythmic accompaniment. So now in this one, Michael Shreve, who played with Santana, is the drummer on here, and Wolfgang Tiepold played cello on here as well. Cello's pretty much done in a rhythmic fashion, and this was quite unusual departure too in another way, and that was the pieces are short. At this time, prior to this, this was recorded in 1981. Prior to this, even in 1980, Klaus Schulze was still doing these 24-minute to 30-minute pieces on his albums. And on this one, this is the first album that he did that was short. It was under 40 minutes. There's 2 songs on here only, and each one is under 19 minutes. So 18 minutes and change for each one. The sound is really good on this, though, and that's the saving grace. I think on this album and this particular period when the percussion started really driving the music a lot more than it had before. Of course, I prefer my atmospherics and my electronics, but to me, and this really started in the 80s, pretty much every album was very rhythmically and percussive oriented. To me, this is actually the best one of the batch, and this would be one of the first, when I see this album, whenever I pull this out, this would be probably the first one that I would play driving in the car. A lot of his stuff for me is home listening. It's not the kind of thing you would, at least of the albums I like, which is his first period, his 1970 to 1980 period. I prefer the things that don't have drums on them, that are a little bit quieter, that don't really work so well in an automobile, a kind of noisy automobile. Albums like Mirage and Time, Wind, and Irrlicht, they're not really made for driving around. But this is probably more a listen to it driving around because of the percussive aspect of it. But it works in that aspect. This, to me, is, one of the better, if not the best. I'm going to drive around and listen to Klaus Schulze music. And I kind of hold off with his rhythmic stuff from this period to pretty much listen to in the car. And this would be and it works. You're driving along and you're getting into the rhythm and the keyboards are kind of fading in and out of the rhythm. But there's not so much going on that you miss very much when you're half paying attention. That kind of thing. The pieces are long enough that you can drift in and out of them, but you don't miss a whole lot because the percussion is such a big part of it. But that was quite a departure for him, and he stayed with that. But that's stayed with that really until well into the 90s even, and he was still at that point, recording an album a year or so. I can't believe I've already done 3-4 albums, whatever. I'm gonna pull one more. But from where? I didn't know I had this back there. Well, here's a guy I haven't talked much about. Klaus Doldinger's Passport. Klaus Doldinger, the German saxophone player that I can't believe is still going and still recording albums. He's the only, he's a leader of Passport, just like Edgar Fresco was the leader of Tangerine Dream. He's the only musician that plays on all of the Passport albums through the years. Passport started, I want to say the very early 70s, it was the late 60s, probably very early 70s. Initially a very electric fusion group, not a lot different from the American fusion groups that were going on at the time. They got a bit more slick and commercial. I'll say maybe not commercial, but less of the fusion things where, there'd be some electric bass guitar vamp going on, and they'd solo over it for 9 or 10 minutes. And great musicians in the band, including Christian Schulze, the keyboard player, no relation to Klaus Schulze. And some of those fusion albums had some real nice mellotron on it, but they really sound dated, and they don't really do much for me. I have a couple of them. They have their moments. As you started approaching the late 70s, I guess Klaus was always a guy, I guess maybe even to this day, that kind of kept his ear toward the contemporary instrumental jazz movement. And a lot of people say he went commercial. There's a couple times, and a couple albums right around this period, that even had like a slight disco funk bass vamp and drum kind of thing going on to a couple of the tracks on their albums, which was a bit too far in that direction. But then others calmed it down a little bit. I wouldn't say it sounds like the smooth jazz the way that people think of smooth jazz, but it was slicker. And if anything, a bit more slightly like maybe prog rock. And for some reason, this album is called Blue Tattoo. I've seen people say this is the worst album they ever recorded, and I honestly think it's one of the best. A lot of their records started having vocals on, so they'd have maybe 2 or 3 vocal tracks on an album. Usually those are the more commercial songs. I gotta admit, a lot of those songs with vocals are incredibly catchy. and a couple of them are just obvious attempts at commerciality. But this one is 8 tracks. It doesn't even run 40 minutes. But to me, they got it completely right. This is one of my favorite albums by Klaus Doldinger's Passport, and I have albums going way up until the 2000s something. He's still putting them out there. What can I say? This is a really good one. If you like kind of slick prog rock, even though there's only one track that even, there's 2 tracks that hit the 5-minute mark, but that's it. So none of them are very expansive pieces. So as usual, Klaus Doldinger wrote all the music, as he does for all of the Passport albums. Occasionally with his vocals, he doesn't write the lyrics, but that's it. Klaus Voormann. If anybody knows who Klaus Voormann is, John Lennon's buddy, who was a bass player, actually did the cover design. I never noticed that before. A bunch of musicians that were kind of in and out of the Passport band at various times. Not people that I know so much on their own. Dieter Petteret on bass. Hendrik Schaper on electric keyboards. David Krieger on drums. And Klaus himself plays saxophone, lyricon, and keyboards and synthesizers. So Klaus always plays synthesizers, and I guess probably electric piano too on the recordings, as well as doing the saxophones and flutes. He doesn't play flute on here, but he's a nice flute player. This also has probably my favorite Passport guitarist. Passport's had a lot of really good guitarists come in and out of the band. There's this guy, Kevin Mulligan, that I really like, and he even sang a couple of the lead vocals on some of their other albums that were in a slightly more commercial vein. And I like Kevin Mulligan's playing so much on the Passport albums that I looked him up, but he is not, I guess he's German. I'm assuming he's German. He hasn't done a whole lot that I could trace down, and when he did music apart from Passport, he doesn't do it under his name. He does it under various names of the project. I found a couple CDs out there that were from definitely after this time period, as this was from 1981. Did I say? I think it's 81. I'm doing that from memory because I'm not finding it. Yeah, 81. I just really like his guitar playing. He's like a. I don't know. Well, you could probably look it up on YouTube. I bet you this album is on YouTube. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure this album is on YouTube, at least individual tracks. I just really like his guitar playing. He probably came out of the rock school, but he's got enough jazz chops in him, enough taste. He's not one of these guys that plays like that heavy, distorted rock tone. I really like his playing. I did find a couple albums that exist that Kevin Mulligan did do on his own, but you can't get them. They're pretty impossible to get physically. And I even created a folder, one of many, in YouTube where I dumped a whole bunch of his music from these albums that I did find. It's probably like 2 complete albums. But to actually obtain the physical CD, which I think are out of print and probably only came in print in Germany, are near impossible. But I really just dig Kevin Mulligan's playing on the Passport albums. So I want to give him a shout out because he's really an obscure musician. How many did I do? Did I do 5 or 4? 1, 2. I did 5. That's a record. That's a record. Hopefully, man, I'm hoping this video processes and it doesn't erase itself when I hit end record. Okay, so thanks, guys, for joining me again. For those out there, I always feel better when I do these videos. And my teeth are chattering, and I still got a bunch of things to do before I can leave the garage. So I'm going to close out for now. Thanks for watching. Hope everybody's doing well. I'll be back sooner or later, maybe inside, maybe here one more time. Who knows? Okay, guys, thanks for watching. Take it easy. Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.